The wonders of the YouTube comment section really are incredible. Here I was, going about my day making videos on the games I've already grown to love, and somebody drops a comment. You should play Hello Charlotte. No idea what that is, but it sounds interesting. And when someone else mentions it's similar to Omori, it suddenly becomes even more interesting. So I sit down with my PC one day and buy the first installment, episode 1, Junk Food, Gods and Teddy Bears. And I get very confused yet intrigued by the unconventional game design and ambiguous storytelling. But by the time I'd finished with the last installment, I was forced to conclude, yeah, as obscure as this series is, it seriously deserves more recognition. Hello everyone. I recently finished with the 3 main installments in a franchise I found incredibly interesting yet surprisingly underrated, namely the Hello Charlotte franchise. It's a series of games made by a developer named Etherain between 2015 and 2018, where you play as Charlotte, a kind and timid girl, or was it a grumpy and snarky girl, and go on a series of wild adventures filled with curious characters, psychological themes, and some absolutely mind-bending lore, which only gets more and more confusing the longer you play. Yet, as much as I was pulling my hair out trying to figure out what was going on while in the midst of it, by the end of the 3rd game, I nonetheless had to say, wow, that was really quite a piece of art, and I need to make a video on it. So here it is. There will be 2 parts to this video. The first part will have only minor spoilers, and in that part I'll try to paint a picture of why this franchise is so interesting and why you should consider playing it if you like these types of psychologically profound RPG games like I do. The second part will be for those who have already played the game, and in that part I'll go into some detail unpacking the super complicated story elements of the game and try to paint a little picture of what I think Hello Charlotte ultimately has to express. So let's get into it. As you've certainly gathered, Hello Charlotte is a franchise about Charlotte. But who is Charlotte? Well, initially it seems that Charlotte is just a kind and timid girl, living in a house under the guidance of her puppeteer, none other than you, the player. And she's a puppet, of course. She lives with her series of perfectly normal friends, every single one of which is an alien, although it isn't immediately clear what that actually means. We have Henry Huxley, the alien surgeon living in Charlotte's basement who operates on corpses in his free time. We have Bennett, the wild ADHD friend who works for Huxley and has a chronic addiction to soap, which seems to be the opium of this world, by the way, and his numerous co-workers as well. We have Aiden, the usually nice guy with horns, who's taken it upon himself to work as Charlotte's butler. We have Felix Honecker, Huxley's no-nonsense nephew with a photographic memory, who aspires to be just like his beloved uncle someday. And then, of course, there's the Umbrella Man, a mysterious and seemingly omniscient character who shows up to give advice every now and then, and talks about his employer. He's basically the G-Man of Hello Charlotte. These characters are just barely introduced in Chapter 1, but in many ways the first game serves as a preamble, and it's only later on in the next 2 games that most of them are developed. One of the things I like the most about the games is that they have a way of creating really compelling dynamics through the inclusion of all these different personalities. There are so many questions, both about the overarching plot elements and about the backstories of these characters themselves, but in the midst of all the plot-related confusion, and, as we'll see, depression, which increasingly takes the stage throughout Chapter 2, these characters serve as anchors and create a feeling of homeliness, despite the unfamiliarity of the bizarre environments and events that unfold. I'd say, in fact, that it's perfectly possible to go through the game without worrying about any of the plot details. Just observing and appreciating all the interactions between these weird, wacky characters can be interesting enough. But enough about the characters. The main reason I think you should give this game a shot, or rather, the main condition I think needs to be fulfilled for me to recommend you give this game a shot, is, well, do you like having no idea what's going on? Because if you do, you should play Hello Charlotte. Let's see if I can do this without including a trillion spoilers. When you initially start episode 1, you might ask yourself a few rather innocent and simple questions. Who is this girl? Why are her friends so weird? Why is everything so white all the time? Why and how is she going inside the television screen right now? Now, these are the questions asked by a Hello Charlotte beginner. If you ask those questions, all I can do is chuckle at your innocent curiosity and quietly pray that your mind survives the rest of what's gonna happen, because boy, this rabbit hole goes so much deeper than that. As we move on through episode 2, these questions are compounded, and initially it seems like things are becoming a little clearer. We're sort of led to believe that the franchise is essentially the tale of a young girl struggling with mental health, a kind of otherworldly allegory of the struggles of social anxiety, lacking self-esteem, and perhaps even schizophrenia. But at the same time, there are all these other questions in the background. What is the true realm? Who is the Oracle? Is any of this even real? And then there's episode 3. If you like plot twists, boy, you can look forward to episode 3. Everything you think you know by the time you've gotten through the first 2 games is going to get turned completely on its head in a way you couldn't possibly have expected. That was one of the joys of playing the games, for me at least. It has a way of leaving you scratching your head, thinking you're slowly inching closer to the truth about what the heck is happening in this weird world, and then it introduces these outlandish plot twists completely out of left field. It's incredibly fun. Anyways, that's about all I can say without getting into the details, so if you haven't played the game yet, please go do so before watching the rest of this video, because we're now going to delve into the details of how this world actually fits together, and then we'll discuss the insights and themes the game ultimately has to offer. As much as I'd like to jump straight to some kind of deep analysis, the plots of these games are so complicated and multi-layered that explaining them is enough of a task in itself, really, so I have to spend most of my time articulating what exactly happens. Hopefully though, in the process of doing that, I'll be able to also talk a bit about what I think the game's themes actually are. So here we go. As the player, you are Charlotte's puppeteer, namely Seth, seemingly a kind of guardian angel who watches over Charlotte and directs her actions. In episode 1, Charlotte goes on a quest with Felix Honecker in a parallel dimension within a television. Inside this television, there are numerous channels with all kinds of bizarre creatures and environments, but one of the key things we learn is that there once existed a hyper-advanced civilization made up of creatures known as Pythias. They all look basically the same and used to worship a certain kind of god named an oracle, which connected them all together into a hive mind. At some point, there was a civil war between those who wanted this hive mind and another faction which wanted independence. Long story short, the independence faction seems to have won and all but destroyed the oracle, and at the end of the game, Charlotte and Felix encounter one of its last remaining iterations. In order to escape this TV world and return to their own reality, Charlotte has to essentially merge the oracle's consciousness with her own so that it becomes a part of her mind. From then on, Charlotte has the oracle, now named Frey, living as part of her own mind. You'll see why this becomes somewhat important later. In episode 2, a new arena opens up. Much of Charlotte's time is now taken up at school. A school which is actually just a part of the house she lives in, but on a different floor. See, the world of Hello Charlotte all takes place within this kind of superstructure known as the house, which has 11 floors, one of them being the school and another being the actual house we initially start in. On the first day of the game, she encounters a new, mysterious and germophobic character, C, real name Vincent, who is being beaten up by a group of bullies on the way to school. She helps him, and throughout the rest of the game, he claims to actually be the, quote, god of this world, temporarily trapped in a human body. We also meet Henrietta Warhol, nicknamed Henri, who's the closest thing Charlotte has to a friend in this place. But as it turns out, Henri isn't really the best person, emotionally manipulating Charlotte and exploiting her for money during school lunchtime. The plot of episode 2 mostly revolves around an event known as the trial, where eventually, at the end of the school year or something, all the students are going to vote, and the person who gets the least votes is going to basically have their souls erased for being quote-unquote defective. We'll talk more about that later. We're also introduced to the battle system, which actually consists in socialization with these twisted distortions of Charlotte's fellow students. As you can see, themes like social anxiety are already popping up. But despite all this, everything kind of seems okay at the beginning. The other students being unnaturally friendly towards Charlotte, except the ones we fight in socialization, that is, calling her their princess or angel. Sort of suspicious, really. But ever since having become one with the Oracle in the previous game, Charlotte has become sick and continuously throws up ink. As the game progresses, it gets ever more depressing, and it becomes clear that Charlotte is an unreliable narrator. By the end, it seems like the overly positive behavior of the students towards Charlotte was a delusion. The students now ridiculing her and eventually assaulting her and forcibly cutting her hair. By the end, we also learn that Vincent's god complex was just that, a god complex. He was actually just a normal boy all along, and his idea of ascending was actually just unaliving himself, basically. He even tries to get Charlotte to join him in completing a suicide pact. Like I said, it's quite depressing. At the end, Charlotte has the choice of who to vote for in the trial, which has now finally come to take place. And this determines the ending we get. If you vote for her friend Henri, then Vincent is the one to have his soul erased. Charlotte breaks down and uses the power of the Oracle inside her to transform into a god and swallow the entire world. The Umbrella Man shows up and offers her a deal which involves her giving him her name. And in exchange, he promises to watch over all other incarnations of Charlotte. You see, each timeline we experience actually does happen, so essentially Umbrella Man offers to watch over the versions of her where we made a different decision. If she votes for Vincent, on the other hand, then she is the one ending up with the least votes, and has her soul erased before fading off into oblivion with the Oracle. And if she abstains, then both her and Vincent are condemned. But she uses the power of the Oracle to wish for everyone's happiness. As it happens, this causes her to absorb the egos of all the people in her world, just like the Oracle did with the Pythias before, if you remember. The Umbrella Man is now the only other person left in the world, and he takes her on a journey through the cosmos, or something, saying that the price for this has already been paid. And the person who paid for this favor was, of course, the other Charlotte, who gave him her name. At the very end of the game, the Umbrella Man speaks to us directly and offers us a deal. We give him our name, which is Seth, if you'll remember, and in exchange, he'll do his best to get a better ending for Charlotte. Now, a few comments on symbolism before we move on to Chapter 3. After it becomes a part of Charlotte, the Oracle largely represents the repressed side of her mind. The color white represents what Charlotte believes the world to be, and black represents everything she doesn't want it to be. It also makes sense since Frey is a male character, and in Jungian psychology in particular, the repressed side of a feminine personality is usually masculine. Now, as episode 2 progresses, Charlotte gradually loses the facade of purity and perfection she starts with, represented by the color white. The ink she throws up could be interpreted as representing the reality that Charlotte isn't actually loved by everyone at school, and that despite her initially positive and oblivious attitude, everything is very much not okay. That reality is slowly boiling to the surface as things become more difficult, and by the end, when her hair is cut, it completely collapses, setting the stage for the endings. Okay, I sure hope you're still with me, because we now get to episode 3. Now, the context for this episode, like I said, is that the Umbrella Man promised us at the end of episode 2 that he would help us get a better ending for Scarlet. So just remember that as we move through this episode. In this episode, we follow the story of a new Scarlet. Unlike the previous iterations, this Scarlet is all but kind-hearted, routinely abusing the tenants of the house. She's obsessed with cleanliness and has started a school club called White Society, where she executes a student chosen by her audience in some ridiculous way, like making cookies out of them using a flamethrower, if you really must know. Kind of similar to the trial, come to think of it. We also meet Charles, who has possessed Vincent's body, and who is not the Umbrella Man, by the way, despite both of them having yellow eyes and routinely possessing people. Henri has become a much more toned down and passive personality, Scarlet now having become the abusive party in their relationship. And there's also another new character, Scarlet Eiler, the class rep, who tries to keep tabs on what naughty Scarlet is doing. The first really interesting twist, though, happens when we're suddenly transported to an entirely different world, the real world, otherwise known as the True Realm. These segments are essentially flashbacks, where we follow Charles Eiler, the one who's possessing Vincent in the False Realm. The big reveal is that the whole world of Hello Scarlet was actually created in the aftermath of the death of the person in the True Realm whose name was Charles Eiler. See, there existed real-world counterparts of Henri, Scarlet Eiler, and Vincent. Henri was his high school girlfriend during his life. Vincent was an internet friend whom he idealized and who took his own life, unfortunately. And Scarlet Eiler was the spirit of his unborn sister who tormented him. Yeah, I know, it's still pretty weird. But in any case, we learn that Charles used to idealize Vincent, who was a successful writer, and who Charles started emulating by writing his own fiction. In one of the flashbacks, right before he jumps off a bridge, Vincent tells Charles about his theory on the afterlife. Apparently, when you die, you don't disappear. Instead, a brand new world is created from your soul. I concluded that our souls are the source material for universes, confined in our bodies. When a person dies, their soul data gets released and explodes like a big bang. Then, a new universe is born. The key point is, Scarlet's World, the place we've spent all our time up to this point, is the world created from Charles's soul after his death. It's Charles's soul world, if you will. All the characters within the world are therefore either people he knew in real life, or fictions and fragments of his own mind. Scarlet, for example, was originally a character he wrote about in his own fiction during his life, who he used as his online avatar. But after his death, she became the eternal protagonist of the new world created from his soul, repeatedly living through a story before dying and being recreated again endlessly. The ominous trial of Chapter 2 corresponds to Charles's medical exams, which he was pressured endlessly to strive towards by his imaginary big sister. The Umbrella Man is the reimagined version of Charles's father, who left his family when he was born. And this thing here, Mother, is the reimagined version of Charles's mother, who was deathly sick during her life, now having become the great mother of the Hello Scarlet universe, endlessly producing new Scarlets and generating new stories and timelines like the ones we've played through. Okay, now at the end of episode 3, we switch to another alternative Scarlet world, again, where Scarlet Eiler, the version of Charles's sister living in the house, is running away from another version of Scarlet, different from any of the versions we've seen so far. Serial number is V19, so you can remember her by that. And she has murdered everyone else in the house, and Scarlet takes it upon herself to find her and face her to avenge everyone's deaths, but ends up killing her in a fit of anger and then regrets her actions. She decides to make up for this mistake by having the Oracle, who lives inside her too now by the way, insert her soul into one of the countless Scarlet vessels constantly being produced by Mother, and become Scarlet. And which Scarlet does she become? Precisely the Scarlet we were playing as for the entirety of the first 2 games. I'll call her Scarlet to differentiate her from the bad girl Scarlet, whose serial number is Q84, by the way. They all have serial numbers. It's a thing in the game. The events of the first 2 games then take place on this TV here, but we skip through it obviously since we did it already. And this TV is also where Charles and Q84 watch the story unfold. At the end, after having seen the events of the first 2 games, Charles now sympathizes with Scarlet, who he was terribly afraid of and who tormented him during his life, but has now of course become the kind-hearted girl we all know. And so he wants to save her from her predicament, the endlessly repeating stories inside her soul cube. If you remember, that was also our original reason for playing the 3rd game in the first place. Umbrella Man promised at the end of episode 2 that we could achieve a better ending for Scarlet, who has turned out, of course, to be Scarlet. That promise has now finally come to fruition after this completely baffling series of events. And there are 2 possible final endings to the series, which we now choose between. In the first ending, Charles and Q84 tried to save Scarlet by using the people in their world as vessels for her now divine consciousness after the events of episode 2. I'm not really sure what happens in this ending, but it seemed like it didn't go that well anyway. The other option is what I think is the true ending. Here, Charles and Q84 save Scarlet by destroying the TV set in which her soul data is contained, essentially destroying her and all the different versions of her story. Yeah, that was the ending you fought for all this time. In the end, Charles decides to put a final end to the looping stories of his soul world by injecting Mother with a poison serum, which crystallizes her, destroying the very foundation of the house itself. There will be no more stories, no more control. At last, we will be free of everything. No more restrictions, no more fate, no more endings. Wonderful, isn't it? Charles then breaks down at the realization of what he's done. It's not even the first time I've seen him break down, and yet, it's okay. It's okay, Father. Your world met its end a long time ago, but a new one will surely begin from scratch. The humanity as you knew it has ceased to exist, only to make room for a new generation. As long as there are believers, their gods will be reborn, and churches will be rebuilt as their sanctuaries. A new day will come, and your time will start moving again. There's nothing to be sad about. This line, "there's nothing to be sad about," recurs several times. Previously, it was said by Charles after the loss of the people who provided him companionship in his real life. First, after Vincent's suicide, and then after losing touch with the real-life Henri. Here, in the end, it becomes a tragic yet hopeful articulation of what I think is the ultimate message of the game. No matter what happens, no matter how much you have to give up, and how many bad choices you've had to make, you have to move on. You have to allow yourself to let go of the past. As Charles tells us, the player, at the very end, Hello Charlotte is a game with no winners. It's a disappointing world of a disappointing person, but in the end, through illusions and metaphors, fairy tales and illusions, we were able to have a conversation. And after letting it all out, getting it all out there, I was able to let go of my regrets. So the story wasn't really about Charlotte all along. Or it was, but more so it was about Charles. Then again, it was also about Scarlet, and Q84, and Henri and Vincent. All of them. In the end, It's a story about overcoming the meaninglessness of a cyclical, pointless world, where protagonists are created again and again for the sake of entertainment and living out their lives for the sake of a story. It's about overcoming one's own fears and limitations, whether it be in the form of social anxiety, self-loathing, or the inability to empathize with others, which is something we see Q84 overcome at the end of the story. It's about how writing and art can serve as a way to connect with others, but most importantly, it's about overcoming and moving on from the loss of someone important to you. Perhaps someone you thought you couldn't live without. As the creator themselves says, "I can only hope this story was able to reflect the desperation and hopelessness over losing someone and the despair at the inability to bring them back, no matter what you do." And on that perhaps not so cheerful note, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you hadn't played Hello Charlotte, I hope I was able to convey a little bit about what makes these games so striking and interesting as a story. And if you have played it, then I hope the story is just a little bit clearer in your mind than it was before. There are a lot of very specific details I had no time to talk about, which I think are deeply symbolic. For example, the imagery around cleanliness and dirtiness throughout the games, the rich color symbolism, and many other things. So leave a comment if you'd like to see another little video going more into the specifics, interpreting different parts of the game. In any case though, thanks for tagging along, and I'll see you next time.